This is part of a mini-series on how to read biomedical research papers. Today, we're looking at the introduction, what it's actually for, how publishers, funders, and editorial organisations define it, and why experienced readers often treat it very differently from the way it's taught. We'll work through 3 real papers at every level, from undergraduate to academic reviewer. If that's useful to you, let's get into it. All right, so most beginners read a paper the wrong way around, actually, I would say. And that's not because they're doing something wrong. It's just nobody's ever really told you how experienced readers actually do it. You're just sort of handed a paper in a journal club or for a tutorial or because someone thinks it's relevant to your project. And the implicit assumption is start at the beginning and just read through to the end. But that's not really how it works, not for anyone who does this regularly. So what we're going to talk about today is the introduction, specifically what it's actually for, which is not what you might think, and how that might change depending on where you are in your training. Because here's the thing, look, the introduction, it's not the most important section of a paper. And if you ask most people who review for journals or sit on grant panels or read a few hundred or indeed a few thousand papers across their career, then we'll often tell you that we read it last, if at all, to be honest. After the figures, after the results, sometimes after the discussion. And that's not us confessing bad habits to you that have built up over our careers. That's just a workflow that starts to make sense over time once you've kind of understood what the introduction can actually do. So let's start there. Right, so as an example, my own reading order, and to be honest, I think this is pretty representative of how most active researchers work, will go something like this. So title and abstract as a quick scan to get my bearings and triage whether I actually want to read the paper or not. Then figures and legends, this is the most important part by far for me. Then methods, selectively depending on what I need to be able to trust the specific data that I'm looking at. Then results, then discussion, and then if and only if I'm reading this really seriously, the introduction. Now, there's a reason for that order, and it's not just me being lazy, I promise. The figures tell you what's actually happened, the methods tell you whether to believe it, the discussion tells you what the authors want you to conclude, which, by the way, is not what you might actually conclude. But the introduction, it tells you something different. It tells you how the story was set up. And you can only really evaluate that once you've seen the story, I think. And that's not just personal habit either. So the classic frameworks for teaching people how to read technical literature, so there's Keshev's 3-pass approach, is probably the most widely cited. These explicitly teach you to triage by structure and contribution before you engage with the narrative sections. The introduction is narrative, and it's not where the evidence lives. So if you've been feeling sort of vaguely guilty about not necessarily starting at the beginning as you go through your training, you can just let that go. Don't stress. You're doing it the right way. It's okay. So the introduction's job is not to teach you the field. It's definitely not a literature review. It's not there to demonstrate that the authors have read widely, even though many of them sort of use it that way. Its actual function is to act as sort of like a contract. And this is where it gets interesting, because if you look how different groups like publishers, funding bodies, editorial organisations actually define what an introduction should do, there's a striking degree of agreement, even though they're coming at it from totally different directions. So major publishers like Nature, BMJ, Springer, all these, they define the introduction very narrowly. Not a history of the field, not like a survey or a summary of everything that's happened before, but rather a short, focused rationale for one question. Why was this study done? Now, the ICMJE, which is the group that sets international standards for biomedical manuscripts, frames the introduction specifically as the section that defines the question being asked. So it's not the section that evaluates whether the question is correct or not. That distinction matters more than it might seem, by the way. And funding bodies like the NIH don't really even call it an introduction in their frameworks. They just talk about things like significance and rationale. What problem exists? What gap remains? Why does addressing it matter? Now, that convergence across the different stakeholders is worth paying attention to. These groups have very different interests, but they all end up describing the same sort of thing, a section whose job is to commit the authors to a specific question in a specific context with specific constraints. By the end of any introduction, the authors have committed to three things: what problem they claim exists, how they're framing the existing evidence, and what exact question they're promising to answer. Everything else is in the paper, so the methods, the results, the discussion, all of those things are constrained by these commitments, whether the authors intended that or not. So that's why the introduction does actually matter, despite me admitting that I often skip it. It's not that it's central, but it is binding. Okay, now one thing that I want to be explicit about, because it does tend to go unsaid, is that different readers are doing totally different things with this section, and that's appropriate. It's not some people are reading it correctly and others haven't yet learned how to read correctly. That's not really it. The introduction does serve different purposes at different career stages, and recognizing that is part of learning to read well as well. So let me go through what that actually looks like. Okay, so if you're an undergraduate or a beginner to reading biomedical literature, your job is orientation. So read the introduction early, ask yourself, what's this paper about? Why does this problem matter? And what is the main question being asked? If you could finish the introduction and you can say in your own words, okay, this paper is asking whether X affects Y in Z context, then that's it. That's exactly what you're meant to get from it at this stage. Don't worry about what's missing from the framing or what the authors might be glossing over. Understanding the question comes before critiquing it. That's not lowering the bar, it's setting the right tone. Okay, so at postgraduate level, like if you're doing a master's, the introduction starts to take on a bit of a different role. So you're not just asking what the question is, you're actually asking, well, why does this question still exist? Why haven't we as a field answered it yet? So read the introduction looking for what's genuinely known and unknown in the current literature, which prior studies are doing the most work in framing this one, and what type of question is this? Is it descriptive? Is it mechanistic? Is it comparative? Here's a test that's worth applying. By the end of the introduction, you should be able to roughly predict the methods. Now, not in detail, but in a broad shape. And if you genuinely can't, that's usually a sign that the framing is maybe a little bit imprecise, or the question hasn't maybe been posed tightly enough. So you're starting to read a little bit more critically at this stage. Getting a bit further into your training, if you're at roughly PhD level, reading becomes a bit more defensive. So you're no longer taking the introduction at face value, you're actually interrogating it. Are conflicting studies acknowledged, or are they sort of sneakily set aside? Are the limitations of previous work stated clearly, or are they sort of smoothed over? Does the final paragraph of the introduction actually narrow the scope of the question, or does it just sort of accumulate all these aims? Now, it's generally seen that a strong introduction constrains what the authors can legitimately claim later. A vague one gives them a bit more room to move around in the discussion. And if the aims are fuzzy at the start, then overreach at the end might follow. You can almost predict that that's going to happen. Getting a little more senior again, if you're at roughly postdoc level, whether you intend it or not, you're probably reading this like a peer reviewer. The introduction is now about positioning. So you're asking, is this gap genuinely unmet, or is it novelty that's been kind of reframed to look like a gap? How is the paper situating itself relative to work in adjacent areas? Is the author's case for importance being made before any data are shown? There's another test that I find useful at this stage. So would this paper still feel convincing if the results were merely competent? So not spectacular, but just solid. If the answer is no, then the framing is maybe carrying too much weight, and that's a vulnerability that reviewers will find. Now, if you're a clinician reading research, your context is genuinely quite different, and your reading should reflect that. Time is real. The introduction functions as a filter. It's not a focus. You're asking, what clinical problem does this relate to? Is the biological rationale plausible to you? And is there any realistic path from this study to something with practice relevance? Now, reading like that isn't a failure to engage properly with it by any stretch. It's reading like someone whose decisions have downstream consequences for actual real life patients. That's its own entire form of expertise. It's not a shortcut. It's just a fact of life that probably the introduction is going to be less of a focus for you. And if you are reading it, you're really reading it quite critically. And if you're a fellow academic or PI, particularly if you review papers or sitting on funding committees and that kind of thing, then you're going to read the introduction as a professional promise to the field, coming back to that concept of the introduction being a contract. So you're asking whether uncertainty is handled honestly and transparently, whether the claims being made are proportional to the evidence that existed at the time, and whether the framing is distinguishing what's genuinely unknown from what's merely sort of inconvenient to acknowledge. Okay, so here's a move that I think is underappreciated, and it's the thing that ties all of this together. Reading the introduction after you've seen the data is often more revealing than reading it first. And I know I've kind of hinted at this already, but once you actually know what already happened, what the authors went on to do with their experiments, with their results. Once you've been through all those figures and you actually understand what the study found, you can go back to the introduction and ask a completely different set of questions. Did the authors define the problem narrowly enough at the start? Did the scope of the question expand after the results were in? Wouldn't be unusual. Were alternative explanations acknowledged up front, or were they sort of conspicuously absent? You're using the introduction to check whether the paper kept its own promises. That's a fundamentally different and much more useful exercise than let me understand the background before I look at the data. Editors know this, senior reviewers know this, and once you start doing it, you won't be able to read a discussion section the same way again, to be totally honest. Now, there are a few patterns that come up repeatedly when you read introductions at this level. They're not always obvious on a first read, but once you've seen them, they start to get hard to miss. The first is what I'll call temporal misdirection. So, is the gap that the authors describe genuinely current? Or was it sort of already addressed in the literature a few years ago and the introduction just isn't really acknowledging that? Now, this actually happens more than it should, and a targeted search around the central claim usually reveals it pretty quickly. The second is aim inflation. Compare the opening problem statement, the thing the authors say is unknown, to the final stated aims. If the aim is broader than the original gap, scope creep is coming. The discussion will almost certainly make claims that the introduction never set up. Thirdly, unit of inference. Are the authors ultimately making claims about cells, tissues, patients, populations? If the introduction is vague on this, then interpretation will probably drift in the discussion. So the level at which something is being studied should constrain what you can conclude, and that needs to be clear from the start. Fourth, negative scope. Good introductions say what they're not trying to answer. They don't just define the question, they actually kind of ring fence it. Now, weaker introductions imply a sort of generalizability that haven't necessarily been earned, and then they sort of rely on that later. And finally, watch for inevitability. I mentioned this before from COPE, and it really is an important concept to get right here. If the introduction reads as though the conclusion is already obvious, if there's a narrative momentum pointing in only one direction before any data are shown, then be more skeptical when you reach the results. Because that sort of rhetorical structure is the shape of a paper that knows what it wants to say before it's shown you the evidence. Right, I want to move over to application of this now. So talking about these abstract principles, I think it is useful, but obviously, as usual, they're going to be more useful once you see some examples that are operating in actual papers. Now, what you're looking at are 3 introductions from papers that I've covered previously on Further Reading. That is intentional because it means that if you want, you can go away and read those videos if the topics happen to jump out to you as something that you might be interested in. Now, these are all well-written papers. The aim here is not to critique them. They're all published in serious journals, and they're doing quite different things. So I want to go through each one and show you how the same section behaves differently depending on who's reading it and when. Okay, so let's start here. This is a large multi-cohort observational study in The Lancet. Adult obesity and risk of severe infection across multiple cohorts, including the UK Biobank. Now, the first thing to notice is how restrained their introduction is here. There's no big mechanism promised, there's no big intervention implied. They're not suggesting that this will change clinical practice. It just establishes the public health relevance, defines the exposure and the outcome clearly, justifies the scale of the study, and then stops. That's it. If you're an undergrad, this is the introduction doing exactly what you need it to do. It tells you why this matters, what kind of study it is, what the outcome it is. So you can summarize the question in one sentence, which you should be able to do for any paper you read seriously. At master's or postgrad level, you should be noticing the observational framing, not just recognizing the word, but understanding what it commits to. The language throughout is careful. Association, not causation. That line is drawn in the introduction, which means it constrains the results and the discussion before you've read them. As a PhD student, pay attention to what's not here. So they're not talking about biology, there's no proposed pathway, no mechanism. In a paper of this scale, covering this topic, you might expect the authors to gesture towards immune function or adipokines or something like that, but they don't. Now, that's discipline. They're not omitting that by chance. It matters because it closes off certain conclusions before the paper even starts. For a clinician, this introduction is essentially a bit of a triage instrument. So large cohorts, hard outcomes, hospitalizations, death. You can assess within a minute whether this is relevant to your practice today, and you know not to expect a recommendation at the end. As a fellow academic or reviewer, what makes this introduction genuinely good is that it survives rereading after the data, so the conclusions can't outrun the framing because the framing was just nice and conservative from the start. It's not a limitation, that's the introduction doing exactly what it should do. Okay, moving to a different sort of a paper. This one's doing something a little bit more assertive, but in a fairly disciplined way. So from the opening, the authors are explicit. Existing biomarkers don't adequately explain immunotherapy response in this cancer. PD-L1 expression, tumor mutational burden, these kind of standard tools, they leave substantial variance unaccounted for. That's the gap, and they state it directly. As an undergrad, this is actually a cleaner narrative structure than the Lancet paper for you. You can see not just what the paper's about, but why it needs to exist. There's a problem. They outline that very clearly. It's not been solved, and this paper is positioned as an attempt to address it. That logical structure, so gap, question, study, is more visible here, and it's worth recognizing it when you see it. At master's level, you should be able to predict the methods somewhat before you've read them. The introduction signals a single dominant variable, a commitment to mechanism, and importantly, a causal claim here. Now, if they're claiming mechanism, there will be experimental work, probably animal models. You can probably make that call before you turn the page. As a PhD student, this introduction is worth studying for its discipline. It's a really good example for you. So it's got one axis, one variable, no hedging across multiple parallel claims. The paper commits fully to intratumoral bacterial burden, which means the paper lives or dies on that commitment. And the fact that the paper exists means it's probably going to live. But anyway, achieving that kind of focus is pretty important. It's actually harder than it looks, and it's one of the things that separates papers that hold together from papers that don't. Now, from a postdoc or reviewer perspective, this is what coherent positioning looks like. No side quests, no scope inflation. You read it and you think, okay, if the data are good, this works. That's the reaction that a well-constructed introduction should produce in someone reading critically. For a clinician, even a mechanistic framing has practical utility here. The introduction explains why existing biomarkers fail in a subset of patients without asking you to become some sort of microbiome expert. The clinical problem is legible, even if the biology itself is unfamiliar. And from a publication ethics standpoint, this is a good example of what honest framing looks like. Uncertainty is acknowledged from the outset. The approach being taken is positioned as a test, not as a confirmation. The conclusion is not preloaded into the setup. That's really important. Okay, this last example is doing something a little bit different again, and it's worth being specific about. So this is a very methods-forward introduction. It's not building towards a single hypothesis. It's more like spending time making the case that existing approaches aren't really sufficient yet. So they're saying that single-cell sequencing isn't quite enough, that bulk sequencing isn't quite enough, and that therefore this spatially resolved approach isn't an embellishment or just like a woohoo, cool toys, but rather something that's actually necessary. Their argument isn't, we did something fun. It's more, the question can't be answered using these other approaches. If you're an undergrad, what I would say firstly about an introduction like this is don't panic. Don't get lost in all the technical detail. What the introduction is telling you is what kind of paper this is. It's going to be sort of a map, a resource. It's not going to be a hypothesis test. The contribution is the atlas itself. So recognizing the type of paper, that's actually a genuine skill that you can build up during this stage of your training. And once you can do it from the introduction, it changes everything that you read after that. At master's level, this is a clear example of methods following questions. The biological problem, cell state, and niche interactions in early LUAD demands that spatial resolution, and the introduction section here makes that case before the methods appear. That logic matters. Methods aren't chosen because they're sophisticated. They're chosen because the question actually does require them, and the introduction should make that case. As a PhD student, and particularly someone who will eventually look to kind of write grant applications, this is the type of introduction that shows you a little bit of insight on how to kind of establish and justify methods. It's demonstrating that you can justify these really expensive, complex methodologies before showing any data, not by sort of defensively defending the technology, but by like making the case that the question itself can't be answered without it. That's an important argument, and it works in front of a funding panel. For postdoc, the strategic positioning here is interesting and it's worth studying. The claims are conceptual rather than specific. The authors aren't saying, look, we found X in Y patients. They're saying the field has been constrained by its tools, and here's an example of why. That's a harder case to make, but when it's made well, it operates at a different level. For a clinician, this introduction probably doesn't require a close read right now, and that's legitimate, that's fair enough. It signals clearly that this is a paper that will shape how research is done in this area, rather than a paper that will have kind of direct practice implications in any sort of a short term. That distinction is worth making quickly, and so in that sense, this introduction follows on as a bit of a triage tool if you've gotten past the abstract and you're still not sure whether this paper is worth a lot of your time or not. As an academic, this is what a platform paper looks like from the introduction. It's not describing what was found, it's describing how the field will ask questions differently moving forwards. Papers that open with that kind of framing are often the ones that are still being cited 10 years later. And I've mentioned in other videos that PIs and academics may not necessarily read introduction sections in as much detail, or may not even read papers in as much detail. But this is the kind of paper that a relevant PI will actually go into super detail on. Okay, so those were 3 introductions that were all really well executed. They were all doing different sorts of things for different sorts of reasons. And you can read them in different ways depending on the stage of your career that you're in. And I guess that's really the point. The introduction isn't really doing one job, it's doing different jobs for different readers. And reading it well means knowing which job you're asking it to do. Undergrads read for orientation. Postgrads read for constraint. Clinicians read for relevance. Reviewers and academics read it for honesty. Same section, same words, very different questions. So, firstly, you don't have to read the introduction first. That's a good thing to learn from this video if you're just starting out. And once you're past a certain point in your training, you probably shouldn't, at least not in the first pass. That instinct is shared by most people who read seriously for a living. But if you never come back to it, if you read it once in the start and then just sort of move on, you do give up one of the most useful tools that you have for spotting when a paper is reframing its own question, or like overreaching in its conclusions, or just sort of quietly or sneakily expanding its claims beyond what the evidence supports. The introduction doesn't matter just because it's the first thing on the page. It matters because it's binding. It's that contract with its reader. Next time we will move on to the methods section, and I'm really looking forward to that one. That's where those kind of bindings from this contract are most often tested and maybe broken. As I said, this is part of a mini-series, so do keep watching the playlist or course wherever you are watching this. And if you would like to find out more about the specific examples that I used in this video, you can have a look at those as well. I'll pop the links down in the description. If you made it this far, well done. Keep on reading. I'll see you next time.